Thanks, gentlemen, for joining us today. So, manufacturing in Africa is a topic that we've been talking about for a long time. It's been part of Africa's development plans for many, many decades. Africa was quite badly affected by the rise of China and East Asia in particular in manufacturing. So some countries that had big manufacturing sectors in the 1980s and 1990s, like Nigeria, really found them affected quite negatively by a lot of activity moving to East Asia and in particular to China. Now, wages in China are a lot more expensive. There's a new bunch of countries now trying to enter the manufacturing space, some in Asia, like Vietnam, like Bangladesh, but also some African countries trying to get involved as well. So, it's an important time for us to have this discussion as China now is moving on from low-wage manufacturing. Actually, just to note, we are going to have some of this conversation in French, so depending on how bilingual you are, and I'm not, so you might want to put on a headset so you can be ready to switch between languages as needed. Carlos, if I can perhaps begin with you to give an overview, from your perspectives from the UN Economic Commission for Africa. As I said, we've been talking about manufacturing for a long time. There hasn't been as much progress as many had hoped. Africa still has poor infrastructure, lack of electricity. Many companies also cite a lack of skills as being a barrier to moving there. Is it realistic that Africa could develop a big manufacturing sector?
Well, it is true that from an historical perspective, the experiences of the 70s have not been very successful. The 80s and the 90s in Africa have been a period where most of the recessive policies have not allowed really industrialization, and now it's back in the debate. And it's back at the time where it's very difficult because the regimes that govern intellectual property have become extremely complex. The trade negotiations have gone in a direction that does not favor Africa, and most of the conditions that were basically used by other regions when they industrialized are no longer there. The global value chains have become extremely complex. It is very difficult today to actually make the labor dimension as the number one attractiveness for you to establish an industry. And niches that were available before, like import substitution that was used in Latin America, or export-oriented industrialization of Southeast Asia and China in particular, are a challenge because Africa does not really possess the competitive advantages that some of these countries and regions offer. So at the face of it, it is not possible really for Africa to enter industrialization with the dimensions that we expect in terms of contribution to the economy and GDP. Manufacturing value addition in Africa has been going down slightly rather than rising. But let me turn all this negative story around a bit to say, number one, Africa already exports about $500 billion worth of manufactured goods. That's not what people think. That's equivalent of what India exports, and India is just one country, but it has a population that is bigger than the 54 of Africa. And therefore, the base is not as bad as people may think. And then the second element that is very important to bear in mind is that the regional market possibilities in Africa are increasing in terms of potential because of the demographic curve. Africa is becoming more populous, but also with a bigger middle class. And finally, I think it is very important for us to bear in mind that some of the technological developments that have allowed gains of productivity in certain industries have also democratized access to technology in some other industries. And Africa can leapfrog and take advantage of some of them if its number one preoccupation is its internal market, which is going to be 2 billion by 2050.
You mentioned trade negotiations. So that's an interesting point for us to pick up on because, in many industrialized or current industrialized countries in big markets like in Europe, North America, there is a rising feeling of protectionism and a move away from sort of promotion of free trade from many of the countries that used to be most in favor of it. The US being the obvious example there. how does that relate to Africa in particular? Are barriers to trade, I mean, both tariff and non-tariff, a key importance for stopping the sector expanding, or is it more about local barriers like infrastructure?
Well, there are two types of angles that we should look when addressing such an important issue. There is the angle of export-oriented manufacturing, where Africa obviously is going to suffer from any protectionist attitudes that are on the rise. And we can see, like, for instance, a country like Lesotho, the minister will probably mention it, has been benefiting from the AGOA, the Africa Growth Opportunity Act of the US. And we don't know whether it will be rolled back, and that will affect a country like Lesotho. So for export-oriented industries, this is a major concern. And some of the negotiations with the European Union are not favoring Africa and are not going to help Africa industrialize. That's my point of view. But then there is the second aspect of the question, or the second angle, which is it is a pressure point for Africa to integrate faster, because the fortunes of the continent are going to be in this huge market if it is actually liberated from the tariff and non-tariff barriers that exist right now within the continent. And if we go in that direction, then not only it will favor the building of a much more solid manufacturing capacity in the continent, but it will attract others to come as well.
So we're going to come back to the issue of regional integration with Kalilou later on in the session. But I'd now like to turn to Minister Abtew from Ethiopia, Ethiopia's Minister for Industry. I mean, Ethiopia is a country that actually has made quite a lot of progress over the last 10 years in manufacturing. I think maybe 10 years ago was not really on the global scene, but certainly now has had one of the fastest growing sectors. We're aware that there's more happening in Ethiopia. And there are some questions now, could this be a model for the rest of Africa? What are the things that have made Ethiopia successful, and what are the things that you would do differently, maybe advice that you would give to other countries looking to go down your path?
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers. It creates a great opportunity for us, especially for latecomer industrialized countries, to know the higher stage, or the global stage, what industrialization means and how it goes in the future. It gives us a great lesson to adjust ourselves and to learn and to exploit experience coming from the other part of the world. We have a vision to make our country a middle-income country by 2025, and we are working on that. And for the last 25 years, we were focusing on agriculture. Agriculture was our basic, almost 80% of the population life is based on agriculture. So we give priority to transform the agriculture from subsistence agriculture to commercialized agriculture, and create wealth from agriculture to implement basic infrastructure for industrialization. And for the last 25 years, we have built roads which connect Ethiopia with different ports to access the international market. And we construct railway constructions, modern, which use hydropower, railway transport facilities. And we develop a number of dams, hydro dams for generating electricity.
Does that mean that electricity is not a problem for manufacturing firms in Ethiopia? Is supply enough, or is there still a need for more?
It's challenging. Our power source grow at, on average, per annum 20%, but our demand for power grow at around 40%. Still there is a gap, especially not only power generation, but also developing substation, transmission, distribution is a very challenging job. a very challenging job. So, now we gradually develop now, and we reach from conventional infrastructure development to develop economic zone, special economic zone, industrial parks with different specialized industrial parks and integrated industrial parks. We are now developing 12 industrial parks in 12 cities. 2 are already complete, and international business companies from around the world enter in the park, in Addis Bole Leme Industrial Park and Awasa Industrial Park. And now they are start export, especially apparel products.
Okay.
The good thing what I would like to share for my colleagues, especially for African colleagues, what we learn from developing industrial park, it's a wise utilization of resource, an optimum utilization of resource, especially to make it environment friendly. Instead of having different effluent treatment plant, it's very wise and optimum to have one common effluent treatment plant and to manage it, all the waste coming from different industries. So such kind of pooling resources and optimum utilization of resources has an advantage to have an industrial park. That is one thing. And the other thing is, it helps to overcome the inefficiency, bureaucracy and other inefficiencies. We can manage all kinds of services, government services, regulatory services inside the park. So no one look the service outside of the industrial park. So developing industrial park save for especially foreign direct investors, save time and save money and bring efficiency. So this is what I would like to share you.
I think the economies of scale point about having enough users to provide central services like effluent treatment and waste is a really important one. And I think we're going to come back later on, perhaps when we talk about Lesotho, this issue about how do you be successful as a small location. Minister, I did want to ask you also about China. So China has been getting more and more involved in Africa, including in Ethiopia. How do you make that partnership a success?
Well, we do have a partnership with different countries, including China. And China is our best partnership. And we call it number one in terms of developing infrastructure. The good thing is we share, we have a policy freedom, and you have to have your own policy, and you have to develop the capacity to administer your development. So for the last 25 years, the Ethiopian government manifests a very nice microeconomy management. So with this, we have a good relationship, and most of the Chinese company, especially infrastructures, road constructions, railway constructions, and hydropower constructions, the Chinese company really contribute a large, both the Chinese companies and the Chinese governments. When it comes to manufacturing industry, not only the Chinese companies, it's the Turkish company, number one in terms of number of projects, number of factories.
Turkey is your number one investor.
Yes, Turkish company also involved in big way. And nowadays, the American companies like PVH groups were in China, now they relocate to Ethiopia. And most of the American companies and the European companies who has a base in China, they are now relocating to Ethiopia. Okay.
And that's, what's the main attraction of Ethiopia for them? Is it the labor force?
I think what we hear from them, not from us, they told us that stability is their major major criteria. Now, Ethiopia is a stable country, and you can work 24 hours in Addis or outside of Addis, and they give value for that. And the second one is all factors of productions are very, very cheap. You couldn't find electricity with 3 US cents per kilowatt hour everywhere in the world. You can get in Ethiopia. Most of the, almost 96-97% of our source of energy is hydropower, which is cheap by its nature, and we can provide for the private sector with 3 US cents per kilowatt hour.
Okay.
Our labor is very competitive, and we are big and most populous country in Africa. I think second in Africa, and our demography is almost 70% of the population is under the age of 30, and we invest a lot in social infrastructures. We establish a number of universities and technical vocational training centers, so we can provide a cheap, easily trainable young force, a young labor force for labor-intensive industries. This is also the other attractive elements what we have, and the other one is the Ethiopian government try to improve the bureaucracy by applying different reforms, and all these attract the foreign direct investment.
Okay. So for Ethiopia, that combination of low costs but plus also a large domestic market is attractive. Yes. That's a good point for us to move on to Senator Joshua Setipa from Lesotho. So your country is very small, so it doesn't have the scale that Ethiopia has in terms of the domestic market, but still also a substantial manufacturer. So, for example, one of the biggest exporters of clothing in sub-Saharan Africa. So for your country that is a lot smaller, a small domestic market, and then, of course, reliant on your neighbours, so South Africa for much of your infrastructure, what are your key challenges for developing manufacturing?
Thank you very much, Simon. I think let me start by observing that we're talking about 54 countries with very different experiences when it comes to these issues. So we have to keep that at the back of our mind, that the experience of Ethiopia is different from the experience of other countries, even in East Africa, even in its neighbors. Now, of course, coming to Lesotho, as you rightly say, Lesotho it's totally landlocked within South Africa, which makes trade facilitation and infrastructure development and regional integration very, very important for us, because without that, we're too small a market to be attractive to any investor, but also our growth potential is within that sub-region. It's within the Southern African region. It's within the broader continental region. So we have a very keen interest in what happens in that regard. If you look at our manufacturing experience, if you take, for example, the apparel sector, where depending on the day of the week, we are number one in sub-Saharan Africa. Sometimes it's Kenya by value, but we are pretty competitive, and we're trying to get even better. We are also the biggest consumer of African cotton. I don't think there's any country in Africa that buys and processes African cotton like we do.
Which is quite incredible for such a small country.
We buy cotton from West Africa, from Benin, from Mali, and then of course the bulk of it also comes from our neighbors, from Malawi, from Zimbabwe. And we process that and make textiles, which we sell to our friends in East Africa, which we process ourselves. And we make clothing, which we sell to the US in particular. But we've been doing this for over 20 years. We've become very good at it. But we've also realized that we can use that experience to get into other sectors. And the automotive sector was a very attractive one because the entry skills you need to make car seats are the same as making clothes. So today we're making car seats for BMW, for Ford, for Nissan. And that is the value of the demonstration of the importance of being within a regional value chain or even a global value chain in this regard. And that depends on also mainly on infrastructure. So the investment on infrastructure for us is very key. And of course, the other factors of growth, competitive utility rates, electricity. We have been blessed with water, so we generate electricity. We are also selling in the regional power pool. We're also looking at other alternatives because as a mountainous country, distribution is very expensive. So we're looking at investments on off-grid solutions, small solar farms and wind farms and so forth. But you also mentioned China, and I think, I don't know how many countries have this experience. I suspect there's a few, but for us, yes, China is a very important trading partner. From an investment perspective, it's not our biggest investment partner. We still haven't secured big investments from China. But politically, they're a very important partner. But the one thing that we also do with China is that we export to China. We export electric switches. We manufacture electric switches. And China Railways is one of our biggest clients. So normally we're used to China exporting manufactured products to Africa or to African countries. I can say we export to China and China buys our products. So that I think is also an interesting story to tell. The importance or the advantage of being landlocked within a country with a very developed infrastructure, whether it's physical infrastructure, whether it's banking services, is that we are able to it's much easier for us to be part of global value chains, for example.
Oh, so that link to South Africa
yes.
really helps.
So it does, of course, it also complicates matters at times, but there are also advantages to it. You cannot even land an aeroplane in Lesotho without getting into South African airspace. Mm-hmm. So sometimes as neighbors we quarrel and they close their airspace. But we do have a very good relationship as neighbors, and our economy is very integrated into the economy. So our banking sector, anybody who comes to Lesotho has access to a first-class banking sector, modern infrastructure. From a global trade perspective, our biggest competitors, particularly in the US market where we're very competitive, are countries like Vietnam. So we also very much closely watch what happens in global trade trends. And for example, the recent decision for the US to pull out of the TPP was a very big development for us because it meant that for as long as TPP does not come into effect, we have adequate time to adjust, to manage that competition that we'll get from Vietnam. But as Mr. Carlos also, Ms. Lopes also pointed out, we are very much dependent on preferential market access that we get from the EU, from the US. So we're very keen to see what the new administration in the US is going to do in relation to AGOA. It has 9 years left, the current phase of AGOA. What happens at the end of the 9 years? We would like to negotiate an FTA so that we have a much more predictable market access. Mm-hmm. And we're hoping that as soon as the administration is up and running, we will be able to start that process. But at the end of the day, it starts and ends with how much investment and how much work we put into making regional integration work.
Right.
So Africa's manufacturing industrialization future lies mainly on how successful the regional integration work is going to be. Because all these multilateral and global economic shocks, mm-hmm. we can mitigate them by also improving our internal trade. Right now, I think we have one of the lowest internal trade rates in the world compared to other regional blocks like in East Asia, mm-hmm. And also in other regions, and the EU, of course. Mm-hmm. So we have to work on that. But for Lesotho, our industrialization, our economic growth depends on how well integrated we will continue to be in the region and, of course, in the continent.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, that's a great a great lead into Kalilou Traore from ECOWAS, so the Economic Community of the West African States. So actually a few of your colleagues have mentioned the need for regional integration and the importance of supply chain integration between neighboring countries. How have you found developing that process in West Africa? Is there a lot of political support for integration? Is it followed through on the ground with real linkages between countries?
Oui, merci beaucoup. Je me félicite que mes prédécesseurs aient mis l'accent sur l'importance de l'intégration régionale, surtout l'impact que cela peut avoir dans le processus d'industrialisation. Pour prendre le cas particulier de l'Afrique de l'Ouest a une communauté économique régionale qui s'appelle la CEDEAO, comme vous l'avez dit, 15 pays, 360 millions d'habitants. Et chaque pays, depuis les années d'indépendance 60, a continué de faire sa politique industrielle de façon séparée. Le résultat est net. Actuellement, nous avons un PIB de l'industrie manufacturière autour de 6% du PIB global de la région. Et donc, pour dire que c'est très faible le niveau d'industrialisation. Et les différentes stratégies politiques qui ont été développées étaient essentiellement orientées pays. Avec l'intégration régionale, donc, nous apportons des éléments, un facteur que nous pensons très fort en termes de marché d'abord régional. J'ai parlé tout à l'heure du marché régional 360 millions, mais aussi nous apportons un cadre politique régional plus fort, avec un code commun d'investissement, avec des politiques sectorielles concertées et intégrées, et avec aussi un cadre technique pour qu'il ne soit pas laissé à la charge de chaque pays de développer tout en même temps. Nous sommes par exemple en train de mettre en place l'environnement du cadre des affaires avec la mise en place d'une infrastructure qualité connectée avec des harmonisations des normes, de connexion des différentes méthodologies, certification des entreprises, certification des produits, toutes choses qui peuvent devenir très chères et irréalisables à l'échelle nationale. Donc c'est un ensemble de facteurs que nous sommes en train de mettre en place pour que la volonté politique d'industrialisation qui a été longuement exprimée par les chefs d'État et par les différents gouvernements puisse, n'est-ce pas, être aidée à être réalisée. Nous essayons également, parce que, comme cela a été dit tout à l'heure, sortir de la logique simpliste qui consiste à améliorer le cadre des affaires et attendre que les investisseurs viennent, venir avec des projets structurés au niveau régional. Lorsque vous prenez une chaîne de valeur comme l'ANACAD, où l'Afrique de l'Ouest est le plus gros exportateur aujourd'hui du monde, le niveau de transformation est encore à 5%. Et là, on est en train de travailler avec un cadre régional d'investissement qui va mobiliser toute la volonté politique des décideurs, qui va mobiliser toute la technicité, qui va aussi mobiliser toutes les institutions financières. Et donc, l'investisseur qui vient dans ce domaine trouve un ensemble d'outils qui peuvent lui permettre de minimiser son risque et, n'est-ce pas, augmenter son taux de revenu. Donc, nous pensons que cette approche régionale est un facteur très fort pour l'industrialisation.
And what is the biggest barrier to more regional integration in West Africa that you've experienced?
Alors, on peut peut-être, après la question de volonté politique et de gouvernance, n'est-ce pas, politique dans le domaine de l'industrialisation sur laquelle nous travaillons, peut-être un des éléments les plus déterminants actuellement, c'est l'infrastructure. Quand je parle d'infrastructure, je parle d'énergie, je parle de transport, je parle également de communication. Et nous avons lancé de grands projets de connexion des États en matière d'infrastructure, en matière donc d'interconnexion électrique, en matière gazoduc, en matière de routes, d'autoroutes de connexion. Et donc, nous pensons que tous ces éléments vont favoriser, n'est-ce pas, le processus d'industrialisation régionale. Parce que lorsqu'on parle de grands marchés, il faut qu'il y ait une certaine mobilité à l'intérieur des facteurs de production, une mobilité, n'est-ce pas, des marchandises à l'intérieur de ce marché. Et là, il faut de l'infrastructure. Et l'infrastructure coûte très cher, et donc, encore une fois, il faut venir avec des projets structurés à l'échelle régionale pour attirer plus d'investisseurs.
Okay. I actually want to come back to the topic now of the private sector. So, Kalilou, I know you're working on the private sector in a West Africa context. But after I ask this question to the panel, I'm then going to come out to the audience. So please do start thinking about any questions that you have for our very experienced and influential panel of speakers, so that we can rather talk about the topics that you're interested in. So please do get ready. But just before I go to the audience, just bring the whole panel back in to think about the role of the private sector. So we've spoken a lot about what governments have been doing and some of the policies and maybe what the public investment priorities are. We have some people here who are from the private sector, maybe who are thinking about manufacturing in Africa. Maybe they're already there in a small way. What are the priorities for someone in the private sector in Africa? What do you have to do to make manufacturing in Africa a success as a private sector operator? Who would like to start us off? Carlos, yeah?
Well, first I want just to dispel very quickly this perception issue that China is a very big investor in Africa, which is not the case, unfortunately. The minister hinted. China is a very important trade partner for the continent, but so far as investment is concerned, it ranks number 5, so it's really quite low in relation to other players. In fact, our number 1 investor in terms of origin of funds is still the US, contrary to perceptions. And if we take the European Union as a region, it is the EU. Now, the reason why there are these differences of perception have a lot to do with the wave of information that has been associated with transformation in Africa taking place because of China presence, like an elephant in the room has become associated with the China presence in Africa. And that is very true when it comes to infrastructure. But again, what people think is that all the infrastructure projects where Chinese companies are involved in Africa are actually funded by Chinese money, which is not the case. Only 1 out of $4 is actually funded by China. The other 3 are money that is coming from different origins, including borrowing by African countries, but the Chinese companies win the bids. Mm-hmm. So this is very important to frame the debate, because what the Chinese companies have been very smart in doing is to seize the opportunities of that market. And we wonder why others are not doing the same. And my simplistic observation is to say they have a negative perception about the continent, their risk perception is wrong, and because it is wrong, they tend to actually add to the cost a risk that does not correspond to reality. If you look into the returns on investment, the average in the world is about 7.2. In Africa is above 9. So it should have been by itself quite an attractiveness. Mm-hmm. And it's not working. Why? Because of this difference of views and perceptions that are quite negative associated with the continent. And I like to compare some realities of Africa with other regions of the world as a demonstration on how wrong people can be about perceptions they have on the continent. Like, for instance, people would say typically that there are too many pirates in the Somali coast, but in the Strait of Malacca, there are 5 times more pirate attacks and pirates than there is in the Somali coast. That's not what people think. People would tend to believe that the Great Lakes region of Africa has a lot of conflict, and yet, you know, the number of casualties from those conflicts is less than the number of casualties in India. because, you know, nobody talks about the Naxalite and the Kashmir and the border conflicts in India.
You must stay for our South Asia session, which is coming up directly
So
after.
you have lots of problems of perception like that that we need to correct. And it's part of the Africans to do a good job in terms of, you know, controlling the narrative. The narrative is far too negative. You know, you will say to people that Lagos has a purchasing power higher than Mumbai. Nobody believes you, but that's the reality. You know, it's in the Ernst & Young report. If you tell people that the GDP per capita of Africa is higher than India, people don't believe you. But, you know, it's just go and compare the tables with the African Development Bank or World Bank or any other source that you want, and that's what the numbers say. So there is this issue of perception. So how do we convince the private sector investor, typically interested in opportunities abroad, to come to Africa rather than go to other regions? Is a combination of elements, but I believe number one is to change their risk perception.
Okay, so your advice is do your homework before coming to a view. I'll just come out to the audience and we can continue the discussion up here, but I'd love to bring the audience in if I can. Does anyone from the audience have a question they'd like to ask in general about African manufacturing or perhaps in particular to one of our panel here? There's one in the corner, okay.
Hi there. I believe you touched upon the importance of youth. In Africa and in Ethiopia, it's 70% under the age of 30, is that correct? So I was wondering, in terms of the gender dimension to the future of production in Africa, where are we at the moment? Is there an important gender dimension or is there not right now? Thank you.
Yeah, Minister?
Thank you very much for very relevant question. Gender inequality in Ethiopia is challenging, and for the last 25 years we have adopted different methods to bring gender equality, and we are successful, especially in primary, secondary and technical vocational training centers. Up to now, in this level, it becomes 50-50. Even in some, secondary school, it is 51-49, 51 women, 49 men. I mean, in the primary. And university, it is around 30%. Not yet. There is a gap because the gap is not yet covered, and this reflects in the job. In the job, especially, it differs from job type. For instance, in garment industry, almost 90% is women, 10% is men. But when we see in terms of valuation or higher payment, we found that women are a low level of job, but men's are a high level, like supervisory level, line manager level, there is imbalance. So we strive to balance the gender inequality. Still there is a gap to do more. Thank you.
Kalilou, if I could bring you in on this one. So you've had some experience in private sector promotion. Do you find a difference between the private and public sector in Africa in relation to gender equality?
Oui, je pense que la question du genre est une question transversale sur laquelle il a été démontré que dans tous nos programmes, dans tous nos projets, il faut avoir un regard particulier sur cet aspect, aussi bien sur les jeunes que sur les femmes. Et donc nous l'intégrons dans nos programmes de façon concrète. Dans le domaine des affaires, nous avons mis en place une fédération des femmes d'affaires. pour mieux développer le dialogue avec les femmes et mieux comprendre leurs besoins en matière d'entrepreneuriat, en matière de développement des affaires dans la région. Et nous essayons de les connecter davantage sur le marché régional. En ce qui concerne donc les jeunes, nous avons cette même démarche et nous opérons notamment à travers des incubateurs. Nous en avons lancé un cette année, donc incubateur pour les jeunes en matière d'affaires, incubateur pour les femmes, mais tout cela est encore à l'échelle de pilote parce que le marché est grand, les masses sont grandes et nous essayons de développer que ce sont des voies qui peuvent nous permettre d'avoir plus de jeunes dans les affaires, développer l'entrepreneuriat local et plus de femmes également et surtout mieux comprendre les besoins des femmes dans ce domaine. Alors peut-être je peux revenir sur la question que vous aviez posée avant, c'est par rapport au secteur privé, quel est le message que nous pouvons porter. J'allais dire, c'est tout le sens de notre présence ici. Lorsque nous venons à un panel aussi important venant de très loin, comme l'Afrique, c'est pour nous adresser au secteur privé et c'est pour nous adresser aussi aux partenaires institutionnels. Pour dire que l'Afrique a eu beaucoup de problèmes, beaucoup de retard, beaucoup de difficultés pour faire son décollage industriel. Aujourd'hui, quelques exemples n'est-ce pas, montrent à tout le monde que cela est possible. Vous avez cité tout à l'heure l'exemple de l'Éthiopie, il y a le Lesotho, en Afrique de l'Ouest, vous avez quelques bons exemples également, comme le Nigeria, la Côte d'Ivoire, qui sont en train de monter très vite en matière d'industrialisation. Donc notre message ici, c'est vraiment de nous adresser au secteur privé qui s'intéresse à venir à la région, pour dire qu'en plus d'avoir un espace plus stable, avec une gouvernance meilleure, nous mettons en place des instruments pour mieux encadrer les investissements. Et nous essayons de le faire en faisant des approches de chaîne de valeur. J'ai parlé tout à l'heure de l'ANACAD. Nous sommes en train de faire tout un travail technique et politique autour de l'investissement dans l'agro-industrie dans un certain nombre de chaînes de valeur, comme l'ANACAD, comme le riz, comme l'huile de palme, comme le cacao, etc. Et donc, nous disons au secteur privé, il y a eu des difficultés, mais aujourd'hui, la région promet en termes de retour sur investissement. On estime que c'est une des zones qui a les retours sur investissement les plus élevés, et aussi en termes, j'allais dire, de réduction des risques, de sécurité, n'est-ce pas, des investissements.
Okay, right. Thank you for the perspectives. Senator, do you have any thoughts on the topic?
Well, I think it is an issue for not just for it's a global issue, but I think for Africa, particularly given the percentage of our populations that is under the age of 30. Now, one of the things that we are also working on is to see how do we address some of the key challenges to unlocking that potential. Mm-hmm. Access to finance. Access to finance is very, very key if you're going to drive entrepreneurship. So we are working with banks to look at how can we find innovative ways of making affordable finance possible. Second one is infrastructure, connectivity. In Lesotho, our target is to discount connectivity by close to 95%. Because if we can discount connectivity, we can then set up the same incubators that are being implemented in West Africa. We can set up innovation hubs. And one of the reasons that we came to this summit is because we are hoping that we can at least begin to build relationships with technology companies that can partner with us in putting in place the right framework that would help unlock this potential for entrepreneurship. Because if we don't do that, we create a situation where you've got this youthful population that looks up to government for employment, mm-hmm. and as a result also undermines your own economic growth strategy. And we know that that is where the future is. So we're hoping that we can be able to build these partnerships that will help us address this challenge that I think is common across the continent.
Well, that's a great point to end on. Unfortunately, we do have to end now. We have run out of time, but I mean, here at GMIS, I think one of the things we really are hoping to achieve is to build those connections between government and private sector and between people from different regions. So we've still got another day and a half to go. So I hope that we have some more connections from this room to help the manufacturing sector in Africa become more productive and to grow. Thanks very much to our excellent panel.